In this video, I'll cover Part F of Gerber Chapter 10 on choosing the right exchange rate system and the Trilemma of international finance. Every government has to choose an exchange rate system, and given that forced decision, you might first want to think about whether one type of exchange rate system provides a superior economic outcome versus the other. And while for long periods of time it was thought that a fixed exchange rate system might produce overall lower inflation, that hasn't been the case in the empirical data in real world results. So no system seems to rank above any other in its ability to provide superior macroeconomic performance. Still, pegs are popular, especially with developing countries, because they offer some degree of credibility. They essentially make it very difficult for a central bank to increase the money supply. Because if your currency is pegged to another currency, say the dollar, for example, and you increase the money supply, that's going to affect the exchange rate. It will depreciate the exchange rate. So it prevents a central bank from acting irresponsibly to some degree. Secondly, pegs facilitate trade, especially if a country has lots of trade with one other country. So, for example, Denmark has a lot of trade with the euro area, of course, so the Danish kroner is pegged to the euro. Pegging a currency gives predictability and stability of exchange rates, and that's its primary draw or benefit. But there are always trade-offs. The biggest trade-off for adopting a pegged exchange rate is that you give up independent monetary policy. In other words, you face a trade-off, and this is called the Trilemma of international finance. The Gerber text does not use the term Trilemma of international finance, but that is what is most often called. It briefly discusses it in the chapter summary, but doesn't give a full explanation. So we'll give a full explanation in these notes. And here are some other sources that you can use, all of which are posted on Blackboard under articles and videos. The impossible trinity, or the trilemma of international finance, means that every country would like to have all three of these things: a relatively stable exchange rate, independent monetary policy, the ability to raise and lower interest rates in accordance with the needs of a changing economy, and free capital mobility. That means the ability to allow domestic citizens to put their savings into foreign countries and allow foreigners to put their savings into the domestic economy. But no country can have all three at the same time. The most that any country can get at any one time is two of these things. You have to give up one or the other. And the reason why this is called a trilemma is because you sort of have three choices. And this triangle is often used to depict this idea of the triangle. You have to pick one side. So if you pick side A, for example, you give up independent monetary policy, but you retain free capital mobility and a stable exchange rate. So let's explain what that means. For countries that adopt a fixed exchange rate, that means that they're not giving up a stable exchange rate. If they peg their exchange rate and fix it, that means they're either choosing option number 2 or option number 3. They're either giving up independent monetary policy or free capital mobility. And here I have a few examples of countries that fall into each category. So for example, we'll go through some specific country examples, but here's just a generic example. When the United States raises interest rates relative to other countries, it causes capital to flow into the United States and out of those other countries. And that causes their currencies to depreciate. I've mentioned before in these lectures that when the United States started to raise interest rates around late 2015, that induced capital to flow out of lots of developing economies and caused lots of other currencies to appreciate because of that change in interest rates. So if a country has a fixed exchange rate regime, the central bank has to do something to maintain the peg and to prevent its currency from depreciating in that example. So how can they do that? Well, they have a few options. They can use monetary policy to raise interest rates and discourage that capital outflow. Savers like to take advantage of higher interest rates, so raising interest rates prevents as much capital from flowing out. That essentially means that you're giving up independent monetary policy because you're forced to use monetary policy to maintain your currency peg or your fixed exchange rate. Another option for limiting depreciation is to just put capital controls, limit capital outflow. If the capital doesn't flow out, it can't depreciate the currency. So that essentially is option number 3, giving up free capital mobility. We talked in the last lecture about the fact that foreign governments and central banks can use foreign reserves to buy the home currency, prop up the value of the home currency because you're increasing demand for the home currency, and that prevents depreciation. That, to some degree, is an option, but that is always an option that is in limited ability to use because reserves will run out. Here, the blue part of my notes goes through this exact same scenario, but just the opposite direction. A decrease in interest rates induces capital to flow out to other countries, which makes their currencies appreciate. So countries that have a peg have to do something to prevent that appreciation. Their options are lowering interest rates to try to discourage those capital inflows, essentially using monetary policy to maintain the pegged exchange rate. They can limit capital inflow by using capital controls to prevent the appreciation. Or they can do a foreign exchange market intervention. They can print currency and sell it in the exchange rate market, increase the supply of their own currency, and that will prevent it from appreciating. But that's essentially a type of monetary policy. So once again, they are giving up independent monetary policy to maintain the peg. Let's see a few examples of this. Let's first look at examples of countries that have given up independent monetary policy. The easiest way to see this is to look at a country that has adopted the currency of another country, which is called dollarization. And it's also easy to see in currency unions. So an example of dollarization was your podcast quiz that discussed Ecuador adopting the US dollar. As of 2018, 7 other countries use the US dollar. They can't print dollars. Only the US Treasury can do that. So they are obviously giving up independent monetary policy. This is a huge trade-off. If the economy falls into recession, they can't use expansionary monetary policy to help. They don't have a lender of last resort either. So, in effect, they give up independent monetary policy when you adopt another country's currency. When you join a currency union, among the other members of that currency union, your exchange rate is fixed 1-to-1. So you give up independent monetary policy. And the European Union provides a great example of this. During the recent financial crises in Greece and the recession in the European Union, countries such as Italy, Greece, Spain needed expansionary monetary policy, but they weren't able to do that because only the European Central Bank it has the ability to expand the quantity of euros in the economy. The European Central Bank eventually gave in and did some expansionary monetary policy. They did some quantitative easing, similar to the United States, which is just a type of expansionary monetary policy. But it took them quite a long time before that happened. So, the countries that are a part of the euro, they do not have independent monetary policy. This is an example of option 2. They do have free capital mobility, though, of course. A third example is a currency board, which is a type of hard peg. If you recall from the exchange rate categories, there were 2 types of hard pegs: a currency board and countries that adopt a different currency. So the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar with a currency board. That means they have to have enough dollars on hand to always be willing to exchange them at a set rate for Hong Kong dollars. So in 2015, Hong Kong was receiving lots of capital inflow from China. We recently discussed the massive capital outflow that was occurring in China during that time. So a lot of that capital was flowing out of China and into Hong Kong. That was putting upward pressure on the real exchange rate in Hong Kong. When the real exchange rate rises, for a floating currency, the nominal exchange rate typically rises at the same time. But if the nominal exchange rate is fixed, and that's what it means when you put a bar over a variable, that it remains constant, then it has to be the case that the upward pressure on the real exchange rate results in upward pressure on prices and inflation. To prevent the upward pressure on the nominal exchange rate, because the Hong Kong dollar is traded in foreign currency markets, Hong Kong was forced to defend its peg by selling lots and lots of Hong Kong dollars. That increases the supply of the Hong Kong dollar and prevents its value from appreciating. This is an article link that discusses that high inflation in Hong Kong, the resulting inflation was a contributing factor to rising housing prices and contributed to the protests that occurred in 2015. In summary, if a nation has a pegged exchange rate and it uses monetary policy to maintain the peg, when capital flows in, that will put upward pressure on the real exchange rate and the nominal exchange rate. To prevent that nominal exchange rate from rising, the country has to either use monetary policy to prevent the capital inflow and thus the appreciation, or they have to use capital controls. If capital is flowing out of a country that has a fixed exchange rate, that's going to put downward pressure on their real exchange rate and their nominal exchange rate. That essentially forces them to use monetary policy to prevent that depreciation. So they would have to raise interest rates, attract capital inflow, and reverse part of the capital outflow. Sometimes raising interest rates is of no avail, and the currency depreciates or collapses anyway. Before we go forward with other examples, I want to give an explanation of how nominal exchange rates and real exchange rates move together in the short run. So recall the supply and demand model of exchange rates we used in ManQ Chapter 19 was a model of the real exchange rate. So what is the relationship between the real and the nominal exchange rate? Well, this is it. It's expressed in this equation for the real exchange rate. In the short run, almost always the two move together. When the real goes up, the nominal goes up. Over the long run, it's not the case that it influences the price level. The price level is mainly determined by what central banks in each of these countries do, the domestic economy and the foreign economy. And that difference in price levels is a factor that determines the real exchange rate over the long run. That's called purchasing power parity. Fixed exchange rates, on the other hand, in the short run, when there's upward pressure on the real exchange rate, if the nominal exchange rate is held constant, then that upward pressure in the real exchange rate puts upward pressure on the price level. If E can't move, the upward pressure has to come out somewhere. It comes out in higher prices. And this makes sense, because one of the ways we've learned that countries prevent their nominal exchange rate by rising is by increasing their money supply so that they can use their domestic currency to increase the supply of it, prevent it from appreciating on foreign exchange markets. And increasing your money supply is the main determinant of inflation. In addition, when there's lots of capital flowing into the economy, there's more demand for assets, and that's just one part of the economy that contributes to the overall inflation level. So more demand for assets puts some upward pressure on inflation. Let's look at two examples of option 3, giving up free capital mobility. One example is Brazil in 2009 to 2011. During that time, quantitative easing was an expansionary monetary policy in the United States that lowered interest rates. And that was a factor that pushed lots of capital abroad into other economies that didn't have interest rates as low as the United States. And this caused appreciation in the Brazilian currency, which is called the real. It began to appreciate in 2009. So here, going down means appreciation. Brazil had a floating exchange rate, but they were very happy with the degree of appreciation because it made their export sector uncompetitive, and it was a large amount of appreciation. It was roughly 40%. And so this sparked the allegation that the United States was engaging in a currency war in 2010. Brazil's options for preventing their currency from appreciating were, 1, to use expansionary monetary policy, lower interest rates, and discourage that capital from flowing in. That would have been essentially option 2, giving up independent monetary policy. That sometimes is an undesirable option, or at the very least it's a trade-off, because expansionary monetary policy will cause inflation in your economy as well. So sometimes it's called importing inflation. What they decided to do eventually was to implement capital controls. So they gave up some degree of free capital mobility, and they switched to a managed floating exchange rate regime. So in other words, from a clean float to a dirty float. Here are a few articles about that. And your podcast quiz discusses this example as well, and the fact that Brazil initially tried to raise interest rates to help control the inflation, but that just added more fuel to the capital inflow fire and caused more inflation. So that is an interesting one. Another example of giving up free capital mobility is China in 2015. Contractionary monetary policy in the United States in 2015 was contributing to the capital outflows in China around that same time that we've already discussed. And that was putting downward pressure on the yuan. If the yuan would have been a floating exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate would have fallen along with the real exchange rate. But because it's not, that puts downward pressure on the price level. So to prevent the depreciation and maintain the peg to the dollar, China has two options. They could have used monetary policy, raised interest rates to discourage that capital outflow, but that was a problem because there was severe worry about the slowdown in the Chinese economy at this time. Increase in interest rates lowers aggregate demand. So that's the last thing they wanted to do. They were preferring to stimulate the economy. So they ended up using capital controls on and off. And eventually those capital controls were repealed in 2018. You can see here from this headline. But without those restrictions, money would flow in and out of the country, forcing domestic interest rates to match those set by the Fed. We'll use this example to discuss another trade-off of fixed exchange rates. This is straight out of the textbook chapter. Two more problems associated with the fixed exchange rates. The first one is that if the anchor currency, that means the currency that your currency is pegged to, if the anchor currency appreciates against a third party, then, that should say then instead of they, the home currency appreciates against that same third party currency. The textbook gives two nice examples. One of them, a currency union in Africa that is pegged to the euro, and discusses the fact that when the euro appreciated against the dollar, so too did the CFA franc. The problem is it makes your exports less competitive in the world because they're more expensive if your currency appreciates. It gives another example about the Thai baht peg to the dollar in the 90s and discusses how that contributed to the Asian financial crisis. The simplest way to avoid this problem is to peg your currency not to one specific country, but to a group of currencies instead of just one country's currency. I'm going to play just a minute or two of a clip that illustrates this problem between the United States and China.
So given that, what is key to this market? What do you think does have the potential to move the market longer term?
And note, this is back in 2015 when capital was flowing out of out of China and into the United States, in anticipation of the Fed raising rates later in the same year.
So for me, this is about the U.S. Federal Reserve and China. So the U.S. economy is doing pretty well, and the Fed wants to raise rates, and presumably it is going to do so starting in December. But at the same time, China, and actually I was just there last week, the economy there has slowed pretty significantly, and the Chinese government has sort of two almost seemingly opposing mandates to accelerate growth while reforming their key industries. And so in China, the currency is essentially pegged to the dollar. It's a de facto peg. And so if the Fed is going to raise rates, then presumably that means the dollar is going to go up, and that puts the Chinese currency under upward pressure against all the other currencies. And that's probably the last thing that China wants to see, because it needs to stimulate its economy. And usually when countries do this, the U.S., Japan, Europe has done it through quantitative easing. That usually involves devaluing your currency, and that I think is the pressure point that is sort of this battle between what China wants to do and what the Fed wants to do.
All right.
And I think that's what it comes down to.
All right.
Lots of examples in there. Fed raising interest rates is going to appreciate the dollar. Why is that? Because higher interest rates will induce capital to flow in to the United States. In effect, there'll be more demand for dollars. The dollar will appreciate. If the yuan is pegged to the dollar, that puts upward pressure on the yuan. That's going to hurt China's export sector. As I just discussed as well, they're looking to do expansionary aggregate demand policies, not policies that decrease aggregate demand, like having a more expensive yuan. Another problem with fixed exchange rates is that the peg can sort of get out of whack, meaning the real exchange rate can rise or fall if there is a difference between the inflation rate in the home country and the country where the anchor currency is. The textbook gives a nice example of Thailand and discusses high inflation in Thailand relative to the United States, pushing up the value of the Thai currency. And again, the problem is it makes your goods and services more expensive on world markets. The most common solution to that is to do one of the types of a soft peg, which is called a crawling peg. It's a soft peg that's fixed but periodically adjusted, so that the real exchange rate doesn't climb in the example that we've just given. The nominal exchange rate crawls upward. Takes some of the pressure off of inflation, helps curb inflation. Let's finish talking about the trilemma and discussing the pros and cons of floating and fixed exchange rates. So the asterisk is the most important things. So for a floating exchange rate, the biggest drawback is the unpredictability, the uncertainty. The biggest advantage of a floating exchange rate is that it allows a nation to have independent monetary policy. The nation isn't forced to use its monetary policy in order to maintain the peg. Another benefit is that a floating exchange rate is a force to push the trade balance towards balance. So continuous adjustment in the balance of payments. That means all else equal, a trade deficit is a force to weaken your currency because people aren't buying your goods and services, so there's less demand for your currency. Weaker currency makes your exports cheaper to everyone else in the world, and eventually your exports rise and your trade deficit falls. The pros and cons of fixed exchange rates. The biggest trade-off is a loss of independent monetary policy. The biggest benefit of having a fixed exchange rate is predictability about the prices in your economy to the rest of the world, because they have to use exchange rates to buy goods and services from you. Stability and predictability is always a benefit for international trade and international investment. Another downside of fixed exchange rates is your currency might be a little bit more vulnerable to speculative attacks. Another benefit is that it might sometimes help prevent a central bank from excessively growing the money supply and thus causing inflation.